Welcome to the Constitutional Court. This is a little unorthodox for us. We don't normally meet like this, but we thought we'd try and get together to answer some of our fellow citizens' questions. I'm Magistrate Abraham, and with me are my colleagues Gerard Lassalle, who audits all of the Senate accounts, and Leontes the Scribe, who is in charge of all the historical record. Wonderful. Have we got a question then? Do
you want to drive straight into the questions, or is there any preamble you want to go over?
Preamble. Someone pointed out, Leontes, I think, reminded me that we should mention that we are not, we don't have all our members today, as Magistrate Karkovic is busy with official duties, so is not present. So technically, we are not issuing rulings from the Constitutional Court. It's more ponderings. So, as Karkovic isn't here to stamp his own individual view on these things, I think it's probably fair to say we generally look for unanimity, don't we?
Generally, but we don't always get it.
We don't always get it, but we try and argue ourselves into the ground until we get unanimity.
Well, you've usefully preempted the first question. So the first question is, how much harmony or unity exists in decision-making between the members of the Constitutional Court?
I think anyone who's met the three of us would probably realise, or the four of us even, we don't always agree or see eye to eye on everything. We're people with strong opinions.
Sorry, that question is from Sten of Ashenhall.
Thank you, Sten. Yeah, people who don't have strong opinions aren't much use on the court, to be fair. But we discuss things at great length. We try to find a way past individual perspectives and argue our way to the core of them, the crux of the matter. So we look for unanimity. We kind of thrash things out until we're all...
That is certainly where we end up, but we are all obviously individuals, and we do have our own individual way of looking at things, however wrong these may be.
We all bring our own perspectives. So there's always, I would say there's always, some things we're just in agreement on from the outset. Some things we'll disagree on at the start and then come to a mutual view by the time we've discussed it at length. Often we'll end up deferring to one person's expertise. So if it's a matter of history, then, Leontes will probably, his opinion will hold greater sway. If it concerns the accounts, then Gerard's opinion will hold greater sway, and so forth. So we tend to defer a little bit to individuals' expertise, but often, most times, I think we get unanimity, but not always.
Leontes, anything to add?
Nope.
Marvellous. The second question we have on our list, what would be required to induct an entirely new nation into the Empire? Vigo, Orlando, Scarlatti di Sarvos.
That hasn't been done in, well, I suppose the last time would be the Imperial Orcs. And of course, then there was the Urizen. Urizen and the Imperial Orcs are the two times that a nation has been inducted into the Empire. In essence, you would need a suitable, appropriately worded Senate motion that would need a throne to ratify it. It would need a 2/3 majority because it would be a clearly constitutional, have strong constitutional implications. So it would need to then not be vetoed by the Synod. And then it would need to meet the requirements of the Constitution. There would need to be an egregore formed for that nation. I think that's about covers it, doesn't it, Leontes?
There might be some constitutional discussion about how many people there needs to be to form a nation. You can't have your drinking club declared a nation, no matter how many supporters you've got in the Senate.
Yes, that's an interesting one. We'd have to study the Constitution very hard if someone tried to get their drinking club declared a nation. It's never happened. But now that you've suggested it, someone's bound to try, Leontes. But yes, there might have to be some kind of, they would have to somehow meet the requirements.
There's an argument that we'd have to, at the very basis, be satisfied that we would allow them to have a senator in some fashion, at least in theory.
Yes. I'm just looking now. We'd have to look very carefully at what the Constitution says about a nation. One of the things we often do when we get these issues is we'll go back to the Constitution and study what it says. The nations of our empire will be embodied by the spirit of an egregore created to preserve its essential character. I think there's a legitimate argument there that the thing that you are trying to formalize as a nation would have to meet the criteria of a nation as an ordinary citizen would understand it. And clearly a group of a dozen people that you're friends with would not meet that requirement in any meaningful sense. I think we'd have to be careful. I don't think you could say that land was a requirement, because clearly the Imperial Orcs didn't possess land when they were formulated.
No, but there was no question that if they did possess land, they'd be able to have a senator.
Yes.
Well, I say no question.
But then I might argue that the legitimate basis for possession of land is to be a nation. But again, I will come back to this idea that you would have to meet the defining characteristics of a nation, and 10 people simply don't do that.
Would be dubious constitutionality to give control of a territory to a drinking club.
It would, yes. But I think, I like to feel that the point where we would draw the line is the point where you try to get the drinking club declared a nation, rather than, we're focusing on, and this is good, you might see this come up a lot, we tend to focus with the Constitutional Court on what might happen if someone sought to abuse this process, rather than on the legitimate question that the individual has asked. Because I saw that question when it was submitted.
With net senators.
It was a completely legitimate question asked with a genuine air of interest. And what we're now discussing is what would happen if somebody tried to abuse it. But that's a part of how we tend to.
So fairly traditionally for the Constitutional Court, we answered the question about 5 minutes ago, but we're still talking about it.
Yes. Shall we move on to the next question, which is a related question, is possibly a little bit more involved. So again from Vigo Orlando, Scarlatti de Sarvos, to pronounce their full name. What would be required to create an entirely new nation within the Empire? For example, combining ex-Yutun thralls and sandfishers, which are currently considered foreigners, as a second orc nation in their own right.
For a start, the sandfishers and the ex-Jotun thralls would want to have to form a nation together.
Yes. I think it's unwise to assume that two disparate groups of orcs might want to just form a nation together. Because they might appear superficially similar to outsiders. So first of all, there would have to be a clear unanimity on the part of those people. I don't think it would meet the definition, and certainly, in fact, you wouldn't. My understanding of the egregore magic is it would categorically fail if you tried to create an egregore out of two groups that weren't culturally homogenous in some way. They'd have
to be a solid metaphysical common ground.
Yes. So that you wouldn't be able to create an egregore for those two groups. But let's imagine that you tried to do it with one of those groups, say the ex-Yutun thralls. Then in theory, yes, it would be the process we've described. You would need a procedural vote in the Senate.
There's an interesting constitutional ramification, however, which is you could create a nation, but to be citizens of that nation, people would have to agree to honour the virtues of the way and support the laws of the Empire.
Yes, which I don't believe the Yutun thralls do they?
I understand there's religious issues.
Yes, I think you're right. So, yes, Leontes, my colleague, is absolutely correct. They would have to meet not just the requirements to be perceptible as a nation, they would also have to meet the various other criteria. They would have to be religiously, they would have to support the way. That's just a flat-out requirement. And there might well be other criteria, but I think that one is the most...
But there'd be no problem with having another nation whose population is primarily orcs.
No, that wouldn't be an issue.
No, not at all. Right, moving on. Is there potential for the Night Realm or similar magical interlopers to forever alter and confuse our constitution? Sten of Ashenhall.
Oh, there isn't?
No.
Jeez.
Okay, so one of the primary characteristics that all Eternals appear to have is that they want to try and influence things. They want to try and make things more to their liking. Now, if the question is, can one of the Night Eternals wave their hand and change the Constitution and make it so that we all have we've all forgotten the Constitution ever seemed to be different? Seems very unlikely. But could an Eternal get a group of people together and convince them of its agenda, or buy them off with gifts and magical boons and things, and put them into and get them into Senate through the election process and have the Constitution changed that way? Aye, it's probably already happened for all we know.
And that's certainly true. Although in that respect, they're not really any difference to foreigners, barbarians, or any outside force.
Drinking clubs.
Drinking clubs.
Yes,
Now, although a
both
drinking
out with
club would
and
like-
within the Empire.
Yes. Yes. So the answer
Why?
is
But magically, no.
no. Obviously, they don't possess that kind of power. There's no evidence of any kind that they possess that kind of power.
So, moving on. Yes. Would it be possible to create subjects of the Empire who must swear to support the laws of the Empire, but without granting them protection from further taxation or allowing them to hold imperial office? Erasmo di Tassato.
So we had a brief discussion of this, didn't we, before today?
Yes.
And it's a very interesting one. And we disagree on why it's disagreeable.
Yes, I personally take a very dim view on the opinion that it might be possible to create people who are effectively bound by all of the responsibilities of the Empire, and in fact, from actually rereading the wording of it, might have more responsibilities than the population of the Empire, particularly with regards to taxation, but without any of the rights and privileges that come with being a citizen of the Empire.
And that's where I would use the word, I think slave would be the question I would raise there. It's once you haven't got the rights of the citizen, but you're part of that nation, but you're not protected as a citizen under the laws, i.e., protected from abuse of your prosperity or other abuses, then then the distinction that rapidly becomes, what are you, and how what are these rightless citizens? And I yes, I mean it opens the doors that have long been closed in imperial society, and I don't think would be a good idea to open them. Now, your argument, I think, Leontes, was that if these people can own property, you couldn't regard them as slaves, and I'm not convinced that's entirely true. I regard the Yatun thralls as slaves, but the Yatun thralls clearly own property. So it all depends on. The point is, you can't do it on many, many levels.
It's a good illustration of something that happens with Constitutional Court, which is that we're all in agreement that you can't do it, but we all have different reasons why you can't. So the argument actually comes down to us trying to convince each other that our individual arguments are the reason you can't do it.
It's quite true.
But the short answer to the question posed is no.
No. And I think it's important to think about as well that the logic there, there is a theory in that, at the end of the day, foreigners have full protection under the law. The only distinction here is that foreigners can be declared barbarians by the Senate. That is, whereas a citizen can't be declared a non-citizen. So, whatever this new category you're trying to create would be, it could only be different if the Senate didn't have the right to declare them not a citizen. It can't work on many, many, many levels.
Right. If an area, such as the trial process, could be seen to be unconstitutional in that it deprives a person of their rights protected under the Constitution, is that something that can be changed? Tyburn Weaver of Dawn. My apologies.
Well, I mean, you can change the trial process, certainly. You could pass a motion in the Senate to have the law changed. Changing the law is within the remit of the Senate, and so by extension, changing the processes of the law is within the remit of the Senate. I suspect we'd look long and hard at that and to see whether we considered it constitutional. We might struggle to regard it as a constitutional change, but it'd certainly be something I would be happier with if it had the consent of the throne and 2/3 majority. Because changing the processes of the law is quite distinct from changing the law. But there's an implication there of because it's unconstitutional, which certainly is not a view of the trial process that I would agree with. Now, it is true that the trial process can involve a loss of liberty, but it's a compromise. The constitutional doctrine isn't meant to be held dogmatically and in totality at all times and in all ways. By that logic, it would be unconstitutional to tax you anything at all, because any tax would be an infringement of your prosperity. In practice, the Constitution allows for some reasonable practical interpretations. So I wouldn't regard it as unconstitutional to deprive you of your liberty at the start of a trial. You've got your eyebrows raised, Leontes.
I haven't got anything constructive to contribute beyond to remind you again that any citizen can demand to be executed if they're that worried about the idea of hanging around to be tried by a magistrate. It would certainly save a lot of time.
Yes, so in theory, their liberty is not deprived since they can return to the labyrinth. That is always an option available to them, although I think I would argue that is perhaps...
Some would argue that it's not an option that is truly being provided, certainly.
Yes.
I like our legal system, to be entirely honest.
I think the point is, yes, you can change the process by which the law is applied, but it's not trivial. It would be difficult.
We'd certainly look very closely at any changes to the way that trials take place or the law is applied that appears to favour one group of imperial citizens more than another.
Yeah.
So, sorry, do you have anything more you want to say, or shall we move on?
I think just to point out, Karkovich isn't here, and he'd probably have a lot to say about anything that made his job harder.
Yes, indeed. Would it be constitutional to remove the restriction of the Master of the Mint being a member of the League? Cormac Dunn of the Oathright.
Almost sounds like he has some sort of plan in mind. Yeah,
this one. I know. Go for it.
Yeah, please do, Leontes. I've talked enough.
Obviously, this isn't an appraisal, but you could absolutely do that with powers that already exist in the Senate, although admittedly reasonably recently. What you'd do is you'd realise that the Master of the Mint is a boss seat, just like control of Suttonstone quarries. You would relinquish the Mint, at which point the Senate would be in a position to determine whether it would be a national boss seat or an imperial boss seat. So you could easily change it to be imperial, which would mean that it would be auctioned to any imperial citizen who wanted to hold it once a year. However, what would be very difficult would be to make it not a league position if you wanted to make it national, because Mint is in Tasato. So what you'd need to do, your additional steps there would be, you need to knock down Mint in Tasato or repurpose it as something useful, and then rebuild another building that has all of the qualities of the existing Mint somewhere else at great expense to tenant, almost certainly. And then you'd be effectively creating the Master of the Mint position again in a different nation, at which point the Senate would again get to vote on whether they wanted it to be imperial or national. What you couldn't do is relinquish the Master of the Mint title and then say that the Mint is going to be an imperial orc when the Mint itself is in the middle of Tasato. I suggest that you might want to use power of appraisal if you're interested in seeing ways that you can make Master of the Mint a more equitable position.
Yeah, if you wanted to move it from one nation to another, but as you've pointed out, Leontes, if you just require relinquishment to simply change it to imperial.
I feel compelled to point out, of course, that the power of relinquishment can be vetoed by the National Assembly of the League in that particular scenario. So you would need to get the League on board.
Yes, you absolutely would.
If you could give one piece of advice to someone setting out on a career in politics, what would it be? Senator Bale of Highgard.
I think we should all answer this. I think,
I have some opinions because I do spend probably the most time of the three of us on the Senate floor.
Please, go on.
Oh, very well. The single largest mistake that I've seen new senators make is... Well, sorry, to start at the start. First up, I have no easy access or any opinions on the matter of getting elected. That is entirely out with our purview and out with our knowledge, if I'm perfectly honest. But once elected, the single biggest mistake I see new senators making is coming to the floor of the Senate, assuming that support can be garnered for their motion on the floor of the Senate, which can be done, but I've seen a lot of senators make the mistake of not already having their support in place. If you don't have other senators prepared to back you on the floor of the Senate, you will frequently find yourself being shouted down by some of the, shall we say, better connected senators. Abraham?
Read your constitution. That would be my advice. Read it, learn it. Don't submit motions that are unconstitutional. If you talk to the court before you submit your motions. I think, but all of that is about being a senator. I think if you are interested in becoming a senator, then I would suggest the best way is just to become involved in the business of the Senate. Get yourself made a proxy, work to help the senators. So if you find a senator that you like and you can work with, find out what motion they're on and then offer to try and help them build support, as Gerard has just pointed out. They need to build support before they bring the motion to the floor, and you can help them do that. Once you've developed a network working for a senator to help them build support for their motions, at the point where you become a senator, that network will help you. But it will also help you become a senator because people will perceive that you are good at this and therefore it is worth having you elected. Be aware that an election is fundamentally a national process. Be aware of your selectorate. Not everyone in a nation votes. Not everyone in a nation can vote. So you need to identify exactly who holds the balance of power, and you need to build a network amongst those people. However that election takes place, you need to identify who those people are that can have you elected, and you need to build a network and an alliance and get the votes and the support. And you can do that through proving your effectiveness. You can do that by offering to support motions or to sponsor motions or bring motions that they want passed. Or you can do it just by bribing them if you're in the Brass Coast, or then not bribe. It's that's how the system works. You just pay. So look at your national process, look at how it works, find out who the selectorate is, and speak to them, talk to them, and build your support. What you shouldn't do is just wait for the election, put your hand up, and say I'd like to stand, and assume that's how it works, because it doesn't. You need to prepare. It's like a military campaign. You need to be ready to fight at the point where the armies come onto the battlefield.
Leontes?
I would like to answer this question with 3 quick quotes, if I may, from previous thrones. A person's loyalty is often conditional, but it is never that way with a hound. The Varushkins are right when they say loyalty is a dog. I would trust my life to my dogs before I would trust any human soldier or kikabeo, because when I look into my dog's eyes, I know his heart. I can never say that about a human being. When his ghost was summoned after his assassination, Emperor Frederick said, in response to questions as to why he'd been killed, I was emperor. I was not in the business of making friends. And finally, Emperor James. The empire is a family, and sometimes it might seem that I fight with my brother, but woe betide the stranger who seeks to get between us, for I will hold his arms while my brother punches him. That's my advice.
History, study history.
So, to move on, by holding today's humans bound to a historic document, does the Constitution run contrary to the doctrine of human destiny, which states that human knowledge increases? Is the Constitution heretical? Nicholas Reaper, a landscaper of the marches.
Nice.
Thoughts, Leontes?
No.
I would say yes. There are some fascinating elements of the Constitution that one might argue were heretical.
What you mean beyond the fact that it opens up by telling people their freedom is to be respected?
Yes, that's an obvious example, which is a clearly heretical virtue. So there are arguments that some elements of the Constitution are heretical, and that it intrinsically doesn't disqualify the document. But the idea that it's heretical because it's a historical document and all human knowledge must be improved is nonsense, because the Constitution can be changed and updated and improved.
And indeed has been over the years.
Yeah, so the idea that we are all somehow beholden to a document that can't change isn't true.
As usual in this sort of discussion, and you'd be surprised actually how often heresy comes up. I need to remind everybody that heresy is defined as the willful rejection or perversion of the orthodox doctrines of the faith as laid down by the Imperial Synod, or actively teaching and promoting false doctrines. It's not blasphemy, idolatry, or desecration. So we need to answer the question with that in mind. Is it a perversion of the doctrines of the faith?
No, it isn't. But it could be regarded as a promotion of false virtues if you take a narrow dogmatic view of it.
The Constitution can change and has done.
Oh, yes, as identified, the question, is it a heretical or a perversion of the doctrines because it's a historical document, is just wrong. It's just factually wrong. I'm just arguing that the document itself could be argued to be heretical in some.
You could also argue, of course, that the doctrines are based on historical documents.
You could, and my experience of arguments of faith is that they are often subject to different viewpoints and different interpretations. That's why we have a synod.
Moving us on, though not very far on, would it take more motions to establish a new virtue and the associated titles, or to abolish one? From
Can I
Liz-Lotte
quickly
van
answer on
Holberg.
the titles?
Please
Quickly. Aye. If you were to recognise or unrecognise a virtue, then the titles of Cardinal, Gatekeeper, and Virtue Inquisitor we would automatically either create or get rid of for that particular virtue. You couldn't have a virtue in the synod that didn't have those titles, because they were created with every virtue will have one requirement. I think that's fair, is it not, Abraham? Right.
Yeah, that's certainly my interpretation.
Yes.
So the titles thing would be covered by the answer to the earlier clause of the question.
Yes. So,
and presumably that would also apply to abolition. Should a virtue ever somehow be abolished?
You couldn't. I'm not sure you can abolish.
You can't abolish a virtue. It's either a spiritual power or it's not. What you can do is not recognise it as a virtue.
Yeah. You could remove the synod could remove the recognition of ambition as a virtue. At which point,
I think that would just require an alteration to the doctrine of the seven, because that's what we would look to determine what the assemblies at synod are. You can't have a virtue recognised in doctrine that isn't represented in synod, and vice versa.
And would we automatically vacate the titles?
Yes.
Aye.
Well, it would automatically abrogate them. They would simply cease to be.
Yes.
I think so. It's interesting because obviously it wouldn't require any sort of Senate approval, would it?
No.
The Senate doesn't have power to say so and so will be a cardinal for a virtue that doesn't not recognised by synod. No. So you just need change doctrine of seven, I think.
Yep.
Agreed.
Which would greater majority of the General Assembly.
There is, however, another thing you'd have to do if I could speculate for a moment.
Please
speculate for a moment. You'd have to weather the unspeakable storm that would then strike empire. At a point where you tell people that one of virtues is no longer a virtue and following it is spiritually bankrupt or questionable, that'd create some ripples. At a point where you say it's okay to hate people, or it's all right to ignore the law if you feel like you've been picked on, or indeed just to ignore the law because you've got individual freedoms. I'm going through a list in my head, as you can tell, or any of the other things that would be required around recognising a new virtue, saying to people of the empire, it is now as fine to hate people as it is to be ambitious, courageous and loyal. I think that would have quite an impact on the way imperial citizens see their relationship with empire.
And each other.
Historically, those seven spiritual powers, if I could speak off record for a moment, selected because they're the ones most likely to support empire. There's a reason the others aren't recognised as virtues.
Yeah.
Arguably, according to history. I'll go back to my book.
we'd have to hope the founders got it wrong, I suppose.
Time to move on to a less philosophical question.
Okay.
Much more dealing with facts. Does the Constitutional Court get paid for their role, Sten of Ashenhall?
We don't get paid a lot.
Don't get paid enough.
I think we're paid absolutely adequately, personally.
Petition your senator for an immediate raise in civil service wages. It's long overdue. You go back and study the historical records. It's been some time since we had a rise.
I think our needs are adequately met, personally.
We get paid. We get paid for our jobs, like most.
All civil servants get paid. Our labour is recognised and rewarded appropriately, and also guaranteed by Constitution. In that prosperity, dignity. It's not specifically written into the Constitution. I've got a farm.
Well, yes, I own a business, but I don't do much work there these days.
No.
But still, yes, we get paid. We get paid for our work that we do.
So, with a constitutional vote in the Senate and ratification by the throne, the Constitution can be changed, which on some level changes your Constitutional Court duties. When are you pleased to see this happen, and what is your nightmare scenario? Tarquinius and Carrion.
Change the Constitution doesn't actually change our duties at all. They remain the same.
It changes. Well, you say that, but if the Constitution changes, it changes. Yes, you're right. Our duties are the same, but the practical application of them alters. Yes. I mean, clearly it has a strong consequence for us. I think, for me personally, the thing that that sort of keeps me awake at night is any point where the Senate passes a motion that's unconstitutional, because any time that the court ends up in opposition to the Senate is just the worst possible outcome for us as the court. That is a disaster, because effectively you've pitted the court against the Senate. We've come up into opposition with our citizens, our fellow citizens, which is a disaster. So any time that a change happens that we have to strike down as unconstitutional is the thing that I fear. By extension, any change to the Constitution that is inherently in line with the principles of the Constitution is something that we would pass. So in theory, is something that we would welcome. I can't imagine that there would be a change to the Constitution that we would be in support of that would horrify us. That intrinsically wouldn't make sense. If we were horrified by it, there would probably be some good reason that we were horrified, and therefore it wouldn't be constitutional. Things that I've welcomed. I don't know. Leontes is better at the historical record. What?
Changes to the Constitution to recognise people as imperial citizens, or the Imperial Court change.
Yes, and anything that keeps the Constitution relevant to modern, the modern empire is to be welcomed. Anything that makes our job easier, where we're not caught arguing over some kind of original definition of the text versus a definition that would make sense when applied today. So anything that really updates it and keeps it contemporaneous is something that I welcome.
Moving on. Could an Eternal or Herald be declared an imperial citizen? And if yes, what imperial body would have the power to make such a declaration? Or does this power sit in the hands of egregores and their ability to declare an individual a citizen of the nation of the empire? From Knight Errant Laka, I believe. I may be mispronouncing that name, my apologies.
Declare's an odd use of a word there. Nobody has power to declare somebody an imperial citizen, really. I suppose you could argue that's what the egregores do, but it's reductionist. That's my opinion.
The egregore recognises someone as a member of their nation, and doing so grants them the rights. Is that a declaration? You can't. There's no law. There's no political body that can recognise someone as a citizen. So the closest that you could get to that, to identifying where that political power lies, is with the egregore.
I would want to point out, of course, that the egregores of the 9 human nations will not recognise anyone who is not human as part of them, and similarly, the egregores of the Orc nation will not recognise anyone who is not an Orc.
Currently.
Yeah, so good luck with getting them to recognise a herald or an egregore, an
Or
eternal.
an eternal.
There's also, so there might be just a biological reason why that isn't possible, but there's also a philosophical reason, isn't there? You know, eternal represents an unchanging, primeval mindset. You know, how could they join an imperial nation? Because they can't embrace the culture of that nation. Because they can't embrace anything, as far as I'm aware. I don't think they can change their nature. Leontes might know more than me about that, but it's not going to happen. So it's a moot question.
Moving on then. How open has the...
No, I did just think of something.
Sorry. Yeah, no, please do.
Personally, I think it's dangerous, and a dangerous way of thinking about it. Think of a herald as separate to an eternal.
Yes.
Right.
Indeed.
Yeah, they are servants of a master.
And not servants of a master in the kind of way that we would understand servant and a master. I often think it's better sometimes to think of heralds as extensions of the eternal. Once you start, it may not be entirely true, but once you start from that standpoint, you get a much better understanding of how heralds and eternals work. I can tell you that.
Yes, quite. But I think, and the point therein is, so the herald can't join because the herald can't express its loyalty to the empire because it's intrinsically its loyalty must be to its eternal, and I don't think the eternal could join simply because its eternal nature would not be compatible with any nation. So can't happen. Sorry, but it's nothing to do with us. It's to do with the nature of egregores and the magic of structured by.
Moving on. How open has the Empire historically been to constitutional reform, and what historical changes are you still shocked by? Sten of Ashenhall.
Well, there were a lot of historical changes in the first few years of the Empire. Obviously, Urizen joined and the Conclave was formed. So significant and monumental changes were made very early on. And then over time, the thing about a constitution is it serves you well. And the longer that it serves you well, the less keen everyone is to see it changed. Probably the obvious historical case when it was changed was when the Imperial Orcs joined the nation. And that was as a result of a war that was ripping the Empire apart. So those are the kind of circumstances you need for a major change. Well, no, those are the kind of circumstances that provoke a major change. You don't need them. There's no legal need for them. Anything could do it. The thing about changes to the Constitution is they have to reflect the Constitution. They have to reflect the spirit of the Constitution and the principles that guide it. So, you know, if you decided to scrap the guarantee of prosperity and freedom and replace them with one with a guarantee of tyranny and oppression and destitution, you might be able to get that past the Senate. I'd like to hope not, but you might. But we would certainly strike it down as unconstitutional. It would be a clear violation of the principles of the Constitution. So in that sense, you know, you can't just chop a paragraph out and write a replacement that's completely different. It has to be guided by those principles. Would you not agree, Leontes?
I think there's a step where certain changes of the Constitution require to destroy the Empire first. There's a point at which you have to just draw a line under it and say this is no longer the Empire, at which point we're out of a job. And I'm very pleased I've got a farm. Although I will be moving if that does happen, but that's neither here nor there. I was surprised, to be honest. There's a relinquishment constitution. Do you think?
Yes, that was it. Yeah, I would argue that was a change to the Constitution.
I think so.
Yes, I would argue. Yeah,
I'm a little surprised by it, by the fact that was supported by Senate. More importantly, it was supported by nations. But
it's worth noting, having recently looked it up, of course, that it was raised twice and was only supported on the second attempt.
I think, yeah, so that's a really good example, isn't it, where the relinquishment, and what happened there was a kind of a desire to change the restrictions imposed by the Constitution, and then over time we worked with senators to find the right mechanism that would afford appropriate protections to individual nations. And actually I think we probably overshot initially, and then we looked to so actually it doesn't need to be that restrictive, but and so when we settled on a definition with the Senate of something that would be practical but would provide the appropriate protections, but that was a change to the application of the Constitution. I don't think we changed the actual wording there.
To be honest, it's referring to the paragraphs in the Constitution that I'm not. No, let's move on to.
I'm going to move us on.
I don't think it's worth getting bogged down in discussion about that paragraph about bulls.
So the next two questions I'm going to ask together, as they are fundamentally linked. So first up, from what nations are the current members of the Constitutional Court, and how do you believe your upbringing has helped you in this particular role? And the second question, what advantages and disadvantages do you feel your different national origins bring to your work on the Constitutional Court? Those are from Sten of Ashenhall and Illyri Bronwyn's Rest of Navarre, respectively.
Well, I'm highborn. Karkovich, who isn't here, is Varushkin. The Chief Magistrate is often Varushkin, in fairness, but not always, and more Varushkin Chief Magistrates than not. The law is an area they excel at. It's something of great importance to them. How do I feel? I'm not sure my highborn upbringing changes. I suppose it gives me a clear sense that what is important is the decisions we make today, and that they're guided by virtue rather than by some tenacious grasp on history. We don't go searching through records that are 100 years old to say, well, what did they do 100 years ago when this question came up? We just were guided by the Constitution itself and by the virtues and by our understanding of it. And so for me, as a citizen of Highguard, that probably is as much as I would say my upbringing affects me. I think in many ways my preference of virtue is more important than my highborn nature. But what about you, Leontes?
I'm raised in marches. I'm a marcher, and I like the way that when a thorny question comes up, we'll often go through documents that are hundreds of years old to look at how people did things when these questions were raised in earlier ages of empire. That being part of my job and everything. I think tradition is important. I also think it helps me to understand the very important difference between leading a group of people and ruling a group of people, and making sure that we remember to stay on the side of the folk leading and not on the side of the people who want to be ruling. That's it.
I, by contrast, am from Dawn and follow the grand tradition of Daunish seneschals, facilitating things throughout the ages and making sure that everything works well. That's largely me.
For the benefit of other people.
For the benefit of all.
Maybe we should move on from this question.
Maybe we should. So, we've now got some questions that have been quickly rushed into me that you won't have seen in advance, just for your added amusement.
Brilliant.
Exciting.
Go back to my book.
So, first up, how much of your decision making is based upon virtue rather than does or doesn't undermine the fabric of the empire? From Skywise Val.
There are no formally trained priests. None of us have extensively studied scripture, although Leontes, as a historian, has by far the best knowledge of any of us of doctrine, far and away the best knowledge of any of us of doctrine. I think virtue influences our decisions the same way it does the decisions of most citizens. We try to act in a virtuous manner. I don't think, but our judgments are primarily legal, not doctrinal. Would you agree, Leontes?
I would certainly agree that the majority of our discussions are legal rather than doctrinal.
For us to comment on doctrine could be seen as stepping on the toes of the synod, if nothing else.
And it's important to note that the Constitutional Court considers the motions of the Senate and scrutinises them to ensure that they are in accordance with the Constitution. We don't scrutinise the decisions of the Synod. The Synod can pass, we don't. Well, we don't. There's no scrutiny of the judgments of the Synod. They could, yeah. So matters of virtue rest with the Synod, not with the court.
We pay attention to it as much as imperial virtues are often just plain common sense. Arguably.
I'm going to move us on. Before someone says something that gets them inquisitioned.
I'm not the one who's been inquisitioned.
Yes, but why weren't you inquisitioned? No, that is a question for another time.
Conspiracy, Gerard.
Can you explain the relationship between the court and other civil servants that citizens tend to interact with most often in Anvil? That individual did not leave a name. Would you like me to repeat the question?
No, I understand the question. I think the thing to bear in mind about the civil service is we each have jobs and we tend to do our job. So the Herald of the Council, of the Military Council, has a clear focus on supporting the Military Council and working with them. But she doesn't come to us for support or help in her everyday job. Do you want to pick this up, Leontes?
I don't think there's much else to say than that. I mean, we don't. We scrutinise the Senate. We discuss stuff like that. We have our roles to do. We're not, as you say, we don't head down to military council. Well, obviously, Gerard does, but he's pursuing different duties. So really, we're just another part of the civil service. You can't take constitutional questions to the civil servants that aren't involved with the Constitutional Court. Or if you do, they'll just pass them on to us. Is that fair to say?
Yes. So we don't, we're not, we're just another part of the civil service doing a job. No different to the Speaker of the Senate or the Herald of the Council. And I think it's probably, it's worth saying we've had arguments with the Speaker for the Senate. We don't really argue with the Herald and we rarely argue with the Speaker these days, but sometimes we'll disagree about protocol or procedures. It's always a back and forth. We're each doing our job, and then sometimes our jobs will impact on each other. But we're not. We're just another part of the civil service.
Okay, to move us on. Historically, which body banned gut wrench and the other poisons? And since Senate introduces new potions into imperial law, does that mean they can withdraw or ban? And if so, how can conclave come in and override that decision via interdiction?
Senate banned gut wrench and other poisons, largely due to the fact that people aren't receiving end of gut wrench and other poisons at a nasty tendency to be senators. That's a legal power.
Interdiction of magic is a power of the conclave. I am aware that there have periodically been attempts to use that more widely than merely to interdict specific rituals or specific magics, and that is, something we look at carefully. But making something illegal is the power of the Senate. What was the other part of the question, Gerard?
Since the Senate introduces new potions into imperial law, does this mean they can withdraw or ban them? And if so, how can conclave come in and override that decision via interdiction?
It is always, incidentally, a lot easier to let people, to inform people how to make a potion than it is to stop them making it once they've found out how to make it.
Indeed.
Yes.
There's a saying about horses and stable doors.
While that's true, I think it's important to note that in theory, I think there was a piece of work done by one of our fine civil servants that identified it would be possible for the Senate to grant the conclave the power to remove a ritual from imperial law, but it'd be expensive. They'd have to go around and extensively destroy all the publicly accessible copies. And of course, it wouldn't remove it from the minds of citizens who knew the ritual, but you could remove it from imperial law. So in theory, it might be possible to remove a potion from, and we don't really talk about imperial law for the herbal arts, but in theory, we could go around and destroy all of the herbal texts that.
I think you'd need to think that at the point where you were keeping a suitably exhaustive text of a potion that had been deemed illegal to know or learn, you'd be breaking law. So it wouldn't be so much that we would Senate would need to send people around with heavy boots to kick down folks' doors and go through their herb collection.
I'm not sure I agree, Leontes. Declaring the use of, or the creation or use of gut wrench illegal is quite different to making the study of gut wrench illegal.
That is fair, but that has more to do with intricacies of how the apothecary's learning works. You can't learn how to make gut wrench without knowing how to make Legionnaire's Stare, Red Willow Paste, or Orla Blackthorn, and vice versa. You could certainly, if we're going with the idea that you could make something not easily available to learn, you could say it's not allowable to teach the Legacy of Thorns, as it's commonly known. But it would be a whole different matter to say gut wrench, which is fundamentally part of the Legacy of Thorns apothecary knowledge, is no longer part of the Legacy of Thorns gut wrench. So that's why that potion, almost certainly why that poison was made illegal, rather than them saying nobody can make these useful blade venoms anymore.
Or equally, the antidotes.
Aye, exactly, the antidotes. At the point where you said that the silver key weren't allowable anymore, you'd also lose the ability to cure people of having silver key used on.
Yeah, and I think so.
So why the conflict? Why is it? Normally things are set up so that one person or body has got control of something, the ability to declare things illegal, and the conclave has the ability to interdict potions. The Senate has the ability to disagree with them and say that they're legal, but neither one trumps other.
I'm not sure that's true. I think they're slightly different. So a status of something being illegal is different to the status of it being interdicted. Something can be interdicted but legal. It can be illegal and not interdicted, or it can be illegal and interdicted. The two have a great deal of crossover. They have similar consequences, but they're legally quite distinct. So one doesn't trump the other. They're just different.
I'm going to move us on to our last couple of questions for this section. Then that will take us neatly up, I think, to the end of our first hour, and then we can move on to the second segment. So, the next question: does the panel have any opinions on how the outcome of some laws affect orcs and humans differently? For example, an execution of a human means passage through the labyrinth with less chance, I assume, of continuing to damage their spirit, whereas for an orc, it just means the end with no chance of redemption. Bloodcrow Yargle.
Is that some sort of plea that the law should be applied more leniently to orcs because they only have one life?
I suspect so, yes.
I think I'd take a dim view of that from a legal perspective. Certainly, we don't take any account of it whatsoever. We don't take any account of that whatsoever. It's an interesting point. I would look to, I'd want to see extensive guidance on the subject from the Synod theologically. I think the chances that the law is going to treat Imperial orcs more leniently than other citizens is nil.
You'd hope that Imperial orcs, knowing they only have one life to live, would be less likely to commit crimes.
Yes.
Marvellous. The final question then of this segment from Jorma Steelhill. What has been the most controversial motion for the Constitutional Court since the death of Britta? I.e., what has caused the most arguments between us?
I'm going to defer to my colleague Leontes, as he has a much better memory than me.
I'm going to defer to my colleague Gerard because he has fewer very unpopular opinions.
I think we argued a long time. Is that the most controversial?
Okay, it's Burst through the Conclave, and it is Trade Envoys.
Oh,
I don't agree.
No,
No, I think we
Imperial
argued
Court?
much longer over the initial application of the power of relinquishment with regards to the
Yes.
territory of Scarsund. I think we argued for well over 2 hours about the is it the dean or the position that has the ability to raise a motion but not vote.
Apologies, I said Burst through a Conclave. Burst through a Conclave wasn't the problem; it was Dean of the Academy.
It's Dean of the Academy, yes.
Aye, the one that had the ability to have votes.
No, they don't have the ability
Raise
to
votes,
vote.
it
They have
said.
the ability
Raise votes,
to
it said.
raise votes, raise motions.
Aye.
I think
I
that
think
was
as well, my colleague Leontes is confusing motions that caused us more difficulty down the line after we passed them when we shouldn't have, with motions that were problematic and contentious at the time.
I
The
mostly
trade-
remember the ones I was very unhappy with.
Yes, quite. But some of that unhappiness developed later. You know,
yeah.
often
Certainly, I think some of our concerns that we raised at the time that ultimately we didn't stop it for were certainly proven right. That is how I would parse that. Yes.
The point is, we make mistakes sometimes, and we let things through. We stop some things that we should let through because we make mistakes, because we're only human, and we let some things through that we should stop. And we try and get everything as right as we can. But the things that cause us a lot of work down the line are the things that we let through that we shouldn't have. Whereas the things that we stopped that we didn't need to have done usually come back up in another form within a few summits or two. So there, you get a chance to review a decision like that. But I think you're right. I think relinquishment was probably the single most contentious thing.
It was a thing that very much did not exist. It would be an entirely new power, but for which there was a clear desire of the Empire and of the Senate to be able to use, despite all of the problems that it links with.
Another thing that causes us a huge amount of work is treaties. I think some of the treaties have been very contentious. Citizens may not be aware, but when a treaty is prepared, it can be raised as a single motion, and it's one of the very few ways that you can effectively make multiple changes to the law in one single motion.
They're certainly contentious, but I wouldn't call them controversial. They're a simple matter of state. I think the individual treaty can be controversial. I don't think the raising of a treaty.
If you want the individual treaty that's been most controversial, it was the individual treaty with Great Forest Oaks.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, okay.
It had some qualities in it that were extremely difficult for us to reach decisions on.
Yes, and that's the one I'm thinking of. And my point is that what citizens may not appreciate is we have to study the constitutional implications of every element of a treaty to ensure that it's compatible with the Constitution. So every treaty is a big piece of work. And if one is contentious, it may have multiple points of contention in it, and so that's the one that sticks in my mind. The one we argued about the most.
Okay. With that, I will neatly bring an end to this section of the Constitutional Court, and
I'm on lunch.
thank you for your time.